everybody. Welcome to Enter the Rift Podcast, Season 1, Episode 2. I'm your host, Kenny, and joining me is my brother, Garrett.
Yo!
On today's episode, we will be discussing the Flatwoods Monster of Braxton County.
Also known as the Green Monster.
Yes. This main story occurred back in the 1950s, or the early 1950s, in the year 1952, in Braxton County, West Virginia, which is the geographical center of the state. And it's still a very rural place today, but even more so back in the 1950s. Back in 1952, the town of Flatwoods only had a population around 288 people. So this is a very, very small town.
Yeah, I was actually very surprised at the actual census of the numbers of people that actually currently live there. I was actually surprised. It was what, 200 and something?
It was about 288 in 1950, and today, with the more recent census data, it's only about 411. So it stayed pretty consistent over the years. So it's only about a little over 100 people bigger now.
Yeah, which is actually shocking, especially after the whole baby boom situation. You would assume that there would have been more people there. I mean, the baby boom lasted from what, 1945 to 62, I want to say.
Yeah, it was around there.
You would assume there'd be a lot more population growth.
Yeah. But this would I would just say that to give an idea of how small this town is and how maybe how different things were back in the early 1950s. This was also the height of the UFO craze, I would say, or this was only about 5 years after Roswell in 1947. So UFOs, aliens, and extraterrestrials were all on the height of everyone's mind back then. Or maybe not everybody, but it was a very popular subject.
Yeah, and if I remember right, one of the boys who was an eyewitness was really into sci-fi comics and stuff, and I believe that's why some of the people may have discounted him at the time when he first said about it, because a lot of people believed that it was an asteroid until, what was it? I know we're going to get into it, but I believe it was 2 hours after he said to his mother that they saw a UFO that she believed it was an asteroid.
After the fact, a couple of days after, there was a big turn in how the main eyewitnesses were treated, and that would definitely be part of the blame. They did say later that the main witnesses were just making it up, that they misidentified things, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, I may be misremembering with the Kentucky Goblins story with the boy of the comic books. I may be misconstruing this.
Yeah, I don't recall reading about anything about comic books from the Flatwoods Monster case, but that could very well have happened. They did try to discredit them after the fact.
Yeah, so Kenny, I don't know if you remember or not, but when we were kids, the show Monster Quest came out, and I know that's when we were first introduced to the Flatwoods Monster.
Oh yeah, the History Channel.
Yeah. So I remember being totally glued to the screen as soon as Monster Quest would come on. That and Animal Planet's Lost Tapes, even though that shit gave me nightmares. Mostly just because of the unsettling vibes, not really the scary content, except for the vampire episode. That was pretty messed up. I remember the first time we saw Monster Quest, that had me glued. The old CRT TV.
Yeah, it was a pretty good episode from what I remember. So let's get into the story. On the night of September 12th, 1952, a wave of UFO sightings occurred over a large portion of the eastern United States, including Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Blazing objects were seen hurtling through the skies, and many witnesses thought they were airplanes crashing in flames. In Flatwoods, a group of 10 boys were playing in a schoolyard, enjoying the Indian summer evening. They ranged in age from 10 to 14 years old. The ages of 3 of them at the time are not known. They saw one of these fireballs soar overhead, with flames trailing behind it, before it came down at a nearby farm owned at the time by a man named Bailey Fisher. These boys ran to investigate, and they passed by the home of the 2 boys who were brothers, Edison May and Freddie May. Their excitement about a landed flying saucer caused their mother, Kathleen May, to join the hunt, as well as 18-year-old Eugene Lemon, who brought his dog. 5 of the boys decided to go home. The other 5, plus the 2 adults, went on to the crash site. By then it was about 7:40 p.m. and getting dark, so they took flashlights. They found an object crashed into the earth and sticking out. It appeared to be pulsing in brightness. A strange sound like whining or hissing filled the air. There was a violet hue to the air. After their arrival, a mysterious frog-like mist began to blanket the area. It had a nauseating metallic smell and irritated their throats and lungs. The dog became agitated, starting barking violently, and took off. It was later found back in town, where it had vomited on a house veranda. It died soon after. Back at the crash site, the boys and adults had yet to realize that the object had actually landed twice, first on the hilltop and then in the valley, and that something living had emerged from it. When they saw it, they at first thought that an animal was perched in a nearby tree looking at them. Kathleen May shined her flashlight on it, and the entire group got a horrible shock. Instead of an animal, they saw a 12-foot-tall figure with glowing eyes standing right next to the tree. As soon as the flashlight beam hit it, the eyes shot out brilliant beams of light that illuminated the entire fog-filled area. The creature seemed to be more of a machine, a metallic casing or suit, or perhaps the creature inside a suit. It was dark in color, but seemed green to some of the witnesses, perhaps because the metallic-like surface reflected the green of the surrounding trees and bushes. It also glowed with light. The middle torso seemed like a cylinder, and the lower torso fanned out like a metallic apron of sorts. Where one might expect arms, there were only 2 short, antenna-like things sticking straight out. Its head was round and surrounded by a stiff coil, or helmet shaped like an ace of spades. The round eyes looked like portholes. It had no feet, but levitated about a foot off the ground and maneuvered around in this manner. The creature glided close to Kathleen May, who felt a warm mist around it. Without warning, it squirted an oily substance all over her clothes. There seemed to be no immediate ill effects from the oil, but the nauseating mist continued to burn their throats. The creature left a trail of oil on the ground as it glided. Suddenly, the horror of it hit the witnesses, and all of them, adults and boys, fled back to town as fast as they could run. At the May Lemon home, Kathleen and her boys lived in a house owned by her father, Joe Lemon. At the May Lemon home, chaos erupted. The Mays and Lemon all had trouble breathing, and the boys were bruised and bleeding, probably from their pell-mell fight. Lemon vomited all day long. Kathleen's eyes were red and teary. Edison and Freddie required medical treatment for their damaged mouths and throats. Around 8:15 p.m., Kathleen telephoned the sheriff's office to report their experience, and the sheriff in turn notified the state police. A state trooper telephoned the co-owner, publisher, and photojournalist for the Braxton Democrat, A. Lee Stewart Jr. Stewart jumped to join the investigation. He went to the May house and gathered a group of armed men, among them Eugene and Joe Lemon, and went out to the scene, but the monster was gone. Some of its sickening odor lingered behind. Sheriff Robert Carr, meanwhile, took 2 of his dogs to the area, but the dogs ran off howling into the fog. He gave up until morning. He found his clothing had been stained by some sort of oil. The military was quick to become involved. The West Virginia National Guard was mobilized by the U.S. Air Force and sent to Flatwoods and also to Frametown, about 19 miles away, where another fireball in the sky had been seen coming down. About 30 troops under the command of Captain Dale Levitt descended on the Flatwoods site by about 1:30 a.m. They were joined by more troops with the assignment to look for a downed airplane. They found nothing, even though some of them stayed all night. A few troops searched the area again in daylight. Stewart also returned to the scene in early daylight and examined some 30-foot-long skid marks left in the grass. While he was studying the marks, his clothes were stained again by the mysterious oil. He found a small, odd piece of silvery metal that looked like dripped solder. He was the first person to break the story in the press. The West Virginia media reported the UFO lights as meteor-like objects streaking across the sky, seen by numerous witnesses throughout a wide area. The story of the monster and how the first witnesses became faint and ill by something that looked like Frankenstein spread rapidly. By afternoon, Flatwoods was swarming with people looking for evidence and souvenirs. They picked up more bits of metal and pieces of a black plastic-like substance and found more traces of oil. The monster sightings did not end just in Flatwoods. A young couple and their 18-month-old son encountered the creature near Frametown on September 13th, terrifying them so badly they didn't speak about it for years. George and Edith Sitkowski of Queens, New York had traveled by car to Cincinnati, Ohio to visit a relative. They were on their return trip, leisurely taking the secondary roads. Around 8 p.m., they entered Braxton County and traveled along what is now State Route 4, between Gasaway and Frametown. Their car died without warning. They could not restart the engine. While George tried to figure out the problem, the air around them filled with a sickening smell that seemed like a combination of ether and burnt sulfur. At first, George thought the car engine might be burning, but that was not the source. The smell agitated their baby, who began crying. As darkness settled in, George was in a quandary. Frametown, the nearest town, was about 12 miles away, too far away for a practical walk. Besides, he was reluctant to leave his wife and infant alone in the car. Suddenly, a blinding violet light shot out of the woods. George opened a window, and the interior of the car filled with a choking, nauseating mist. Despite the smell, he got out to investigate, retching violently. About 200 to 300 yards away was a luminescent spheroid that looked like a giant frosted street lamp. It floated in the air and moved back and forth. George walked closer, still sick. He began to feel hot, and then felt a sensation like low-grade electric shock course throughout his body. Now frightened, he turned to hurry back to the car, but his legs turned rubbery and he fell repeatedly. Then he heard Edith scream. It was a blood-curdling scream, like a banshee. He lurched back to the car, where he saw a huge figure illuminated in the light from the spheroid. It was about 8 to 9 feet tall and shaped like a man, but with a reptilian head. It had shoulders, a weirdly bloated body, and a lower torso that seemed to be a solid mass of some sort. George scrambled into the car and pushed his wife and child onto the floor. He grabbed a knife out of the glove compartment. The creature moved closer until it was directly in front of the car. It reached out a spindly arm that ended in a soft, bisected fork of fingers and ran it across the windshield and hood, as though it was examining the car. Then it turned and glided back into the woods, disappearing from sight. Within a few minutes, a globe of light rose slowly above the trees and moved into the sky, suddenly shooting away in a trail of brilliant light. Badly shaken, George tried the ignition again, and this time the car started without a problem. They drove until they reached a truck stop diner, probably near Sutton, and went inside to compose themselves. They resolved not to talk about what had happened. They then found a hotel and spent the night. The next morning, George found a forked discoloration of the hood on his car where the entity had touched it. The metal looked like it had been singed. A couple days later, on September 15th, resident of Wheeling sent up a hue and cry with calls to the police department about sightings of a monster near Vineyard Hill Housing Development near Ogleby Park. The media dubbed the creature a fugitive from fairyland, which flew in on a flying saucer. It left before anyone actually saw it, thus earning the nickname Bashful Billy. All the calls to the police, apparently, were secondhand reports. However, there were reports of a body of a badly burned woman found at Vineyard Hill, with no further details provided. The original witnesses at Flatwoods were subject to intense media scrutiny in the aftermath. Men who said they were from the government in Washington came and interviewed them and took away their oil-stained clothing, bits of metal and plastic, and any other pieces of evidence. None of it was ever returned. Descriptions of the monster reported in the media became distorted. The creature had bulging eyes, clawed hands, and was green with a blood-red face. It wore a monk-like robe or tunic. It was half man and half dragon, and it breathed fire. It was a Frankenstein monster with BO. Police were quoted dismissing the monster as a product of mass hysteria. The original witnesses were invited to be interviewed by the press and to appear on television. They were portrayed as ignorant country folk whose imaginations had run away with them and had been scared out of their wits. And the Charleston Daily Mail reported on September 15th that the monster was nothing more than the combination of an airplane warning beacon and a flashing meteor reflected on the trunk of a dead tree. On September 23rd, the Charleston Gazette ran an interview with a local insurance man and amateur astronomer. who insisted that the monster was an illusion created by gases from a meteor. Earl Stevens of Bell said that fireballs originate from an electrical discharge in the Earth's outer atmosphere and give off sulfurous gases. Stevens said one of the parties apparently flashed a light on the gas ball just the instant before it disintegrated into the thin air. The reflection of the light onto the gas gave it the shape that people described, he said. Stevens offered his testimony to the Gazette in the interest of what he termed attempting to erase the fear of supernatural beings from the minds of the people. On October 9th, the Charleston Daily Mail gave considerable space to a woman identified as Aunt Rebecca Frame, aged 90, who insisted that the Braxton Monster was pure silliness and was mistaken for a snake, which grow big up there. With such convoluted, ludicrous explanations as above, ordinary citizens might have more to fear from the so-called experts than any supernatural beings. Kathleen May said she received a letter from Washington, D.C. about a month after the incident, informing her that the object was an experimental military craft designed for lunar travel, and that 4 of them had appeared in the skies on the night that they encountered the monster. This seems to be corroborated by the publication of an article about moon rockets in Collier's magazine at the same time at the arrival of the letter. The Flatwoods case attracted the attention of leading UFO researchers at the time, among them retired Major Donald E. Kehoe, Ivan T. Sanderson, and Gray Barker, who conducted their own interviews. Sanderson concluded that the case was real and that the monster was from somewhere else, not Earth. Kehoe commented that this was the weirdest of all saucer stories and had dangerous implications because of its fearsome creature intelligent enough to build and control spaceships. To the public and media, however, the story was more of a carnal sideshow. After a flurry of attention, the case fell into the backwaters. Inevitably, claims of hoaxing surfaced. In 1977, reporter Adrian Gwynn of the Charleston Daily Mail revisited the Braxton County Monster case and reported that the newspaper had been contacted recently by a former resident of West Virginia who claimed responsibility for hoaxing the monster, Bill Stewart's, formerly of St. Albans and Sutton, and at the time of his writing a resident of West Palm Beach, Florida, said that on the night of September 12, 1952, he and A. Stewart Lee Jr. were driving from Heaters to Sutton when they ran out of gas. Stewart said in a letter to the paper, "We noticed a disturbance across the road and went to investigate. There were some small children all stirred up. Having a sawed-off 12-gauge in the car, he went on the hill to see what was going on. The kids had been playing in a pasture field and some of Bailey Fisher's cows were in the nearby woods. Seeing that nothing had happened, we went on to Sutton. Being slightly intoxicated, we fabricated the story of the Braxton County Monster. We called the Gazette from the Braxton Democrat office. Stewart's dad owned the newspaper at the time. The skid marks were made by Bailey's old Ford tractor spinning its wheels. The grease was raked from under the tractor by tall grass. We drew the artist's picture of the monster. From there, it just mushroomed. Kathleen May and her children went to New York on a TV show. Scientists from all over came to investigate. We sat back and laughed. My father knew what we boys were doing, but his store was doing a booming business from the tourist trade. As with most hoax claims, no evidence was offered, just the claim itself. Many people will believe a claim such as this despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's as though human beings are uncomfortable with evidence of unknown creatures in our midst and thus will grab at any straw to convince themselves otherwise. In 1990, Frank C. Ficino Jr., an artist and paranormal researcher, became interested in the Flatwoods case while visiting relatives in Braxton County. Riveted, he began an investigation that consumed much of his life for the next decade. Ficino tracked down original eyewitnesses, delved into media reports and government documents, and interviewed military and government sources. He published his findings in 2004 in his book, The Braxton County Monster, The Cover-Up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed, revised in 2007. The summary of this case is based on his well-researched investigation. Ficino had a different account of A. Lee Stewart Jr., whom he located for an interview. Stewart had left West Virginia in 1958, and he left the Braxton County Monster story behind him as well. He was, said Ficino, shocked at how he had been grossly misquoted and portrayed by previous reporters and writers. According to Stewart, after getting the call from the state trooper Ted Tribbett at about 9 p.m., he headed out to the May home. En route, he passed at Stewart's house, where Bill and his father were still working, and picked up Bill to take along. At the May home, they found panic and turmoil. Stewart recruited a group to investigate. They were armed with 12-gauge automatic shotguns and handguns. At the site, they found the skid marks, noted the lingering foul odor, but found no monster. They returned to the May home, where Stewart talked more with the witnesses. He then took Bill Stewart's home and went back to his office. He called a friend who had a reel-to-reel tape recorder that he wanted to borrow to interview the witnesses on record, which he intended to do the next day. He contacted his attorney, Olin Berry, to ask advice on breaking the story. He went to Berry's home, and Berry placed a call to the Charleston Gazette at about 2 a.m., explaining to the paper that Stewart should be credited with breaking the story. Ficino found enough corroborating accounts and evidence to make a number of conclusions. One, that the meteors that flashed through the skies in September of 1952 were actually 16 alien craft in groups of 4. They appeared over the Gulf of Mexico, where mock wargame exercises were taking place. Ficino speculates that perhaps the aliens thought the games were real war and were monitoring them. Their crafts were detected and were pursued by Air Force fighter jets, which engaged them in combat. One of the craft was damaged and landed at Flatwoods. The marooned creature that was seen by witnesses was encased in a metallic suit, and was seen by the Snakowskis partially out of its suit. It evidently was rescued and escaped. Another damaged craft crashed at Wheeling. The creature may have been killed and its body recovered up by authorities, who substituted a burned woman corpse cover story to deflect attention. Government officials quickly moved to collect evidence, discredit the witnesses, and dismiss the entire affair. I think that was a very interesting story. I couldn't really even imagine what that would have been like, especially back then when we don't have the context for different kinds of aliens or extraterrestrials that we do now.
Yeah, especially considering, we're talking a very rural area. Most of these people, their only source of media is generally just books and radio at this point. So, and, newspapers. But to, mobilize the National Guard and the Air Force, and doing all but to mobilize, the National Guard and bring them into that area. Everybody's going to take notice of that. It's going to be a total hell in a handbasket. Everybody's going to be running around like they're nuts. But I don't get it. It's the amount of people, and I get it. This was a point in time where we had, uranium glass all over the place. But to be like, oh, there's an alien? I'm going to go get a souvenir.
Yeah, let's go pick this thing up. It's going to give me arm cancer 20 years from now.
Yeah, I'm going to walk around this in my pocket as a souvenir. My kidneys are going to shut down, but hey, it looks cool.
It's shiny. It's neat. You pick up neat things.
Yeah.
But I definitely think something happened. Otherwise, there wouldn't be, if they did actually scramble the National Guard and everything, something had to have happened. It wasn't just, they wouldn't do that for no reason. Something had to have occurred.
Yeah, definitely. Whether it's an alien spiritual entity, or regardless, maybe even though some kind of government program that had to do with maybe, I don't know, some kind of aircraft. Now the monster itself is a little hard to really say that involved in the military directly, especially with the technology at the time. Although, for all I know, that could have been some kind of weird mechanized suit that they were using, or something. I don't know. I'm doing some mental gymnastics just trying to even play devil's advocate with it, because if the statements are true, what as accurate as possible to what the eyewitnesses have seen, it's very, very freaking odd.
Yeah. And to say that these people, they're just dumb, ignorant, country bumpkins.
Yeah, podunk hillbillies.
Who confuse it with an owl or a reflection of their flashlight off the gas of a meteor is just, I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, especially considering when you look at the sketches that were done by the witnesses with the police department, or I can't remember who it was in the story from the other media that I was looking into this with. But they gave reports and sketches of the entity they witnessed, and they all gave the same statements with the drawings. It wasn't like a mix-up of words. We had them draw it out, and we can clearly see that they all seen something.
Yeah,
exactly
you
the
would
same.
think that if it was some kind of mass psychosis or like a shared hallucination, you'd think there'd be more.
Psychoactively induced hypnosis via chemical gas exposure. They
Yeah,
would
you
not
would
be seeing
think
the
they
same
wouldn't.
thing.
There would be much more of a variation between the eyewitness accounts, but there was not. They all pretty much say the same thing.
I get it. You know, person by themselves. You know, maybe yeah, a crashed plane with some kind of noxious fume, maybe like a carbon monoxide. They would get a little loopy and maybe see like the taillights and they'd be like, "Oh, holy shit, big old demon." But yeah, for all of them to be like, "This is what I saw. I drawed it. We didn't do this by each other. You interviewed us separately, but we all drew the same thing." Well, now you come to the conclusions that we all saw the same thing. So yeah, it's a little bit peculiar, a little
Yeah, for
weird.
sure. And then you get into the whole incident that happened near Frametown with the Sitkowskis, and it's like, so was the thing damaged and it had to like rip off part of the suit, and that's why it went from what the Mays saw in Flatwoods, where the whole thing looked metallic, to where now only like the bottom half is metallic, but the upper half
Yeah,
is
now
like
it's
a
like a
reptilian
reptilian.
form. I've heard some people say they theorized that the reason it was levitating on the ground and had that like cone like skirt is because it didn't have legs, but it had more of like a serpent like lower half where it was just like a snake.
Yeah, that not makes a little bit more of the spiritual thing than the maybe alien entity kind of deal. Because if you look back for like most folklore throughout the Aztecs to the Sumerian to the Babylonians, like with the serpent-like beings that descended and all that kind of stuff. Which, yeah, you could argue that's same species alien, or it could be this is the physical representation of a spiritual entity that is just occurring. But the whole idea of putting its palm on the vehicle and leaving the handprint, I want to see what that car looked like afterwards. I want to see some actual photographs. That
Yeah,
would be really
that
cool.
would have been cool if they did actually take pictures of the vehicle afterwards and say, hey, look, here is like the handprint from where this being touched the car. But they were so shook up about it that they didn't even want to speak about this event for a long time after it occurred.
Yeah, so plus, I mean, we're talking about more than likely they didn't really go into like the background of the family. They might have been not the most well off, and cameras were they're pretty expensive back then. So a lot of people didn't have and a lot of people didn't have just a camera, just with them at all times, obviously. And when they were traveling from was it Ohio to
Yeah,
New York,
and
so most people have been like, I mean, they're going to visit family. They might bring a camera, or they might just be just traveling and really not even worried about that kind of stuff. At the
well, if
time, they
they
might have
did
been
have a
poor.
camera, it may very well have been packed away with their clothes and things.
That too.
With and to go back to the cell sulfur, there's that the sulfurous scent again.
Yeah, definitely. Like, so you have a serpent-like reptilian, sulfur, red eyes. Um, they're all kind of getting a little similar there,
Yeah, I know
huh?
there's some people that will say it's just the overarching phenomena, but like it could be maybe like the sulfurous scent is like a side effect of any kind of potential interdimensional being jumping into like our plane of existence, So like maybe something happens when something comes through. So that's why you would hear that metallic sound, or that's why you get that the smell of ozone or sulfur, because like that's like a side effect of like opening the gate to get into this plane of existence.
Yeah, the ozone. That's exactly what I was about to touch on. Was you get a lot of that too, but those encounters are usually a lot different with the ozone smell. Now with the sulfur, it always seems to be like an entity of like malice, or like at least gives the people the impression of they're about to be harmed. Maybe a malevolent being of some nature, possibly of the demonic
Yeah,
persuasion.
that could definitely be a possibility.
This was at the time of Project Paperclip was really in its full swing, and we know how the Nazis were really into the occult. So it's a possibility that's why the military was even mustered up to begin with, is they were doing something and then they were waiting for something to fall down. That's why they were able
So
to
quickly,
mobilize.
potentially.
Yeah.
I do think it's pretty interesting how all this happened in the course of a couple days when there was a huge flap of other UFO sightings. I think that helps lend a little bit more credence to this whole story and event for the eyewitnesses, because it wasn't just happening just in Flatwoods, but there were sightings and a huge thing of UFOs across the entire eastern part of the United States. And later, the investigator Ficino, like, if he was correct, and there was like even things spotted all the way down from the Gulf of Mexico up, that makes me think that it was just another attempt by the government potentially to try and down one of these crafts to collect any kind of material or evidence that they could to further their the research into extraterrestrials.
Yeah, and considering the government has within the last, I want to say 2 years, was it 22 when they released the statement that UFOs are in fact
I
real?
think it was 2022 where they released that statement regarding UAPs.
Yeah, with the naval pilot footage of the Tic Tac. So it's almost like how far back does the government records go on this? How long were they making contact? How long were they engaging with them? Because if we can't engage with the aircraft now, no chance back in 1952. I mean,
Yeah, I'm curious how. Yeah,
got prop planes,
they
jets,
start of jets. Yeah, but I was kind of curious. It's like how were they able to shoot it down? Was it like, were the Air Force pilots actually able to shoot it down, or was it a case where, like, some people think that it was dropped on purpose?
Yeah, kind of like how a lot of the skeptics, or what would you call them? Not really a skeptic, but people's theories on the gifting program, kind of like, like we just have these ships, they just drop them off kind of situation. Like, here you go, have it, re-engineer.
Yeah. So maybe it was just pure coincidence that the people in Flatwoods ran into this being when they did. Maybe they thought, since it was like a rural enough area, that they weren't going to encounter anybody, and there was also a surprise on the being's end that it ran into anybody.
Yeah, there is that too. I mean,
that kind of maybe threw a wrench in their plans.
Yeah, they landed in the heavily wooded area. If this was from, let's play the devil's advocate and say that yes, this was in fact real, and an extraterrestrial being that was gathering data on, like, maybe, I don't know, flora, fauna, soil samples, whatever good old Dick Finger here was doing.
I don't think it was gathering any samples, like, because it doesn't seem like it was trying to do anything like that. Like in other stories that I've read about, when the things are gathering samples, like, they're usually like chanced upon by somebody, and the beings are actively like taking samples of the soil or anything like that. I think this thing was either crashed on purpose, or somehow the U.S. government was able to shoot it down, and it crashed in Flatwoods. The people just happened to be close enough by to be able to go and see it before it was able to evacuate itself.
Yeah, true. A little odd though that they make it all the way all the way here and crash. A little odd that they always crash.
It is kind of weird. You'd think with having such advanced technology capable of like faster than light travel potentially, like, they get here and all of a sudden they're just like crashing with a strong breeze. It doesn't seem like that's the case, unless there is the chance, with the whole ultra terrestrial theory, where they're not from, outer space. They're just from a different dimension.
That's more of the stance I take on most of the cryptozoological and the extraterrestrial. I mostly believe it to be a extra dimensional being. Mostly, I'm just on the stance it's a demon, but because not the best impression.
No, they definitely don't give the best impression. They don't seem to be, at least these ones, and like things like the reptilians or the greys. They don't seem to be very benevolent at all.
Nah, they're always here, coming over here, scaring people, or playing with people's holes or making holes.
Oh my god,
kind of their deal.
Yeah, I would say things are either they're either neutral and have their own agenda, or they're evil and they're just trying to use humanity as a resource to further their plans.
Yeah.
So we know that in the aftermath, the main eyewitnesses were treated absolutely awful. They were ridiculed, shamed, and then I think that stopped a lot of other eyewitnesses from even coming forward, because, there's no need to cover up other people if you take the first group and you make them an example of, like, this will happen to you. Your life will be made a living hell if you try to come out with any story or account of this.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't want to stand up and say, hey, I saw it too, after you just witnessed a whole demoralization campaign done on your friends and
Right.
neighbors.
There were other sightings of at least like the flying saucers, but those people didn't come out. When I say flying saucer, I mean UFO or UAP. Those people didn't even come out until decades later, because they were so worried about what would happen to them if they spoke out as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, you'd be basically ostracized. I mean, every time you go down to the store, I mean, you would have to have at least a few times you look up and see people either A, talking about you or giving you an odd look, like, hey, look, there's that freaking weirdo. I saw a UFO, a little green man. I mean, you're definitely going to get that.
Oh, for sure.
Even after the fact, even when they felt it was probably comfortable to say it, I mean, you're probably going to have people still doing that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, even though they just told the truth of their experience, they were definitely, like, their whole reputation were just tarnished because of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, could you like really put yourself in their shoes? I mean, you see something where you're questioning everything at this point, like down to the bare minimum, really. I mean, because you're going to be like, well, if I stand up and say something, I'm questioning, what's going to happen to me in my social circles? Am I going to face some kind of threatening, like, behavior done by the government to me? Like, am I going to be silenced? You would have to, really question, like, did I really see it? Like, did it really happen? You'd be playing it all back, but you still see all the other people around you who did come out and say it, that they saw the same situation, really verbatim of what you saw. But you really be put in a rock and a hard place with your whole situation. I mean, as far as dealing with the burden of witnessing it alone is going to really cause, like, just absolute upending of your life.
Yeah, and I think for most people, or at least a lot of them, it's not worth it. It's just better to play it safe and keep quiet.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, I mean, let's say it's not even an alien. You saw a government program that you weren't supposed to see, and you did it in a time where, I mean, people nowadays have, obviously, I mean, currently we're right now on a podcast, but we have more of an access to use our voice and First Amendment right to come out and speak. But this was at a time and place where, like, I mean, yes, you had the right to speak, but you were also limited to your town. I mean, it'd be pretty hard to even get your opinion
unless
out
you were
there.
able to get onto, like, a national newspaper or a very large radio station. It'd be very hard.
Yeah, or contact some kind of publisher or some other, I don't know, media outlet. But that's it. You're limited to a media outlet. You're not limited to your own voice. So under the threat of government suppression, you're pretty shit out of luck.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, if your voice did get out, you may have gotten out in maybe a couple articles in, like, some UFO magazines.
Yeah,
maybe
which there were UFO researchers,
couple,
because, this was after Roswell.
Yeah, right. So you have the chance of having somewhat of a, I don't know, a soapbox to speak on, but really you're kind of deplatformed from the start.
For sure. Overall, I think this is a very interesting story, and it's a great bridge between the UFO community and then the monster/cryptid community. I think it's a very fun story, no matter what happened. I think it is it's just fun to be able to talk about these sorts of things.
Yeah, especially with the overlap that you get between the supernatural paranormal aspects with the sci-fi ooh, like spooky spaceman stuff. That's pretty fun. But yeah, I think that, like, this was definitely a subject that really, like, got my attention as a kid. Really drew me into the whole cryptids and paranormal stuff. Really got my
Oh,
wheels
same
turning.
here. I think it definitely helped create a more of a fascination with the paranormal.
Yeah, like subjects like it's very odd with West Virginia. Like you get a lot of the overlaps of the paranormal and the cryptid, like especially with like Mothman, you know, Flatwoods.
Yeah, it's a very active state. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Enter the Rift podcast. Please like, subscribe, leave us a review, tell your friends. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you guys so much for listening. Have a great night.
Bye bye.